This is Breakpoint This Week, a weekly briefing on faith, culture, worldview, and mission with John Stonestreet, president of the Colson Center for Christian Worldview.
Welcome to another edition of Breakpoint This Week, a program of the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. I'm Shane Morris, and back with me today to talk about the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective is John Stonestreet, who I believe was on a boat last week. How was that, John?
I was on a boat last week, actually with a group of friends and my bride, without kids, and we love our kids. We love our kids a lot. We also love having weeks without our kids. But it was a great time. Actually, a partner ministry of ours, Family Life, a ministry founded by Dennis Rainey and now carried on in some really remarkable ways. They do a great job with marriages, and we just had some very good friends that we were with, and it was a good time. And we didn't get the coronavirus, so there's that.
Well done. I can't think of anything better for marriage, though, than the ability to have an occasional break from the kids. So Dennis Rainey is doing his organization's doing a great job there.
Yeah, they really are. And, marriage is hard. I mean, that's actually one of the things you and Warren talked about last week with this very interesting article. And we have by David Brooks in The Atlantic about whether the nuclear family was a disaster, or however he put it. And, what's interesting about the whole thing is there were things he said David Brooks said that were very, very true, and then things that, weren't. But at the same time, I think there's a punchline that comes out of that, which is there's no substitute for marriage as the foundation of family, and there's no substitute for family as the foundation for society. But marriage is hard, and family's hard. And so without a strong social support network, without kind of the ability to have help, it's just it's hard. I don't know how else to say it. It just is difficult. And so I think Andrew Walker had a terrific piece this week where he really talked about the sort of thing that David Brooks was calling for, which is, kind of chosen families to replace extended families that were once kind of much more a part of our lives and much more a part of kind of cultural norms than they are now. I said, hey, there's something that looks an awful lot like this. It's called the church, and you kind of look back at it, and the church plays such an important role. And so, even just where we were last week, while that article and all the responses were popping on that was, I think, a great example of an opportunity. So we look at the destruction of the family, Shane, and say, what a tragedy, because it's a tragedy. It's almost like you fix this, you fix everything that's broken in American culture. You fix fatherlessness, you fix the breakdown of marriage. I mean, you fix entire communities, and you certainly fix big social ills. And so what an opportunity for the church. We talk about it as if it's kind of the tragedy of our age, because it is. And at the same time, it's an incredible opportunity for the church to be the church, as Chuck would say.
Folks, be sure to catch the commentary we've done on Brooks's article, and then we'll also link to a great symposium over at the Institute for Family Studies, Bradford Wilcox organization, and there have been great contributions there, just sort of exploring the ideas that Brooks brings up in his really impactful and I think potentially historic column. So we'll link you to those at breakpoint.org. John, I want to get to a story this morning that's it's very sobering. It's a reminder, I think, that according to persecution watchdogs like Open Doors International, we're actually living through one of the worst periods of global persecution of Christians on record. And one of the current hotspots of Islamic extremist violence in particular is Nigeria, mostly due to Islamic State affiliates. World Magazine reports that earlier this month in states across Nigeria, about 5 million Christians turned out in the streets to march, pray, sing, and hold banners saying things like, "All souls are precious to God, and we demand justice for this genocide." And the reason was there was a call put out by Christian Association of Nigeria for a prayer walk, a peaceful prayer walk, in response to radical Islamic murders of Christians. And this has been an intense problem in the region. In total, I think Vatican News estimated that over 1,000 Nigerian Christians were murdered in 2019 alone for their faith. And since 2015, that total has been around 6,000 Christians. And some of the stories, John, coming out of Nigeria are just horrific. It's usually attacks on innocents. Islamic marauders are sweeping through Christian villages, killing a dozen Christians here, kidnapping others. One attack occurred actually earlier this month, left 30 people dead And then others, and the more severe attacks, have seen up to 150 innocents gunned down in a single night. So it's just, I mean, it's a horrific situation, and it's almost like on an Acts or New Testament level persecution, like something we would have seen in the early church.
Yeah, Shane, at one level, it is attacks to that degree when you talk about the kind of violence that we're seeing. But it also is a reminder, I think, to the rest of us, like the way American Christians and Western Christians have been able to live now for a while is really out of character with the history of the church. Like we're the exception to the rule, and it's a good exception. I mean, when people pray for persecution, I think, well, that's easy for you to say, right? I mean, the persecution does have a role to purify the church, and that's God allows that to happen at certain times. But the idea of praying for it, to me, just seems so misguided, as opposed to praying for our brothers and sisters to endure, and that God would mercifully, defeat their enemies, because this is horrific stuff. And it's not just Nigeria, but I think as Mindy Belts, who was our week 3 instructor for our current short course, brought up this past week in our course on preparing for the 2020 election. She spent a lot of time talking about domestic issues, and that was one of the things she brought up is the issue of religious freedom, and specifically Nigeria. And we've had stories coming out also out of Burkina Faso. One of our dear friends is a guy named Dave Garrison, a Southern Baptist missiologist, just came back from Burkina Faso. And literally a week before, another story landed where I think it was 30 or so people that were killed. It's, I think Mindy's right in that region, the hardest place on the planet right now to be a Christian, which is saying a lot, right? When you think about what's happening in China and what's happening in North Korea, and has been for quite a long time. But this is just incredible stuff. We feel powerless, and I want just to remind us that prayer is not powerlessness. Sometimes when we pray, we're like, what can I do except pray? That's something. And that's not just a something, that's a real something, right? It matters. It moves things. And as God orchestrates history and as God sustains these believers. We also had a milestone. I don't know, Shane, if you picked up on this, but this week was also an anniversary. I can't remember how many years, 4 or 5 years, since the martyrdom of those 21 Coptic Christians on the beach in Syria. And, right. Of course, last year, Mama Maggie, whose schools, I think about 17 of those young men grew up in, there in that whole region, received the Wilberforce Award. But theirs is a story now that is being told in the lores of the Fox's Book of Martyrs. In the kind of the same sort of category. We had, really amazing pieces. Our friend Mark Rogers at the Clapham Group is helping produce an animated short describing their stories. So much was focused on kind of the incident of the beheadings there. A lot of people have that kind of iconic image. The only images, by the way, Shane, we have from that are from the terrorists themselves. And
from
so
the executioners.
Yeah. I mean, it's just kind of a stunning thing. And we look and say, look, here we are, and we feel powerless. But don't feel powerless. We're part of the same kingdom. We have the same king, and we can pray on their behalf, and we ought to do that.
As we pray, John, I think there's something we can learn here about the nature of Christianity. Right now I'm reading Tom Holland's book, Dominion, and he talks about how early Christians radically changed the conception of suffering, the meaning of persecution. See, the Romans' weapon, their chief weapon to keep people in subjugation was this humiliation and fear through their creative methods of torture, mostly. And Holland tells this story about how he was at one point in the Middle East, just miles from where ISIS had been actually crucifying people in imitation of the ancients. And he said he'd never really understood what the Romans were up to until he felt in his gut this chilling fear at knowing that he was only a short distance away from where these torturers were. And he realized for the first time what it was like to be under the thumb of Rome, to have that hanging over your head, that you could be crucified and humiliated in this way. But Christians, not only did Christ himself reverse this sign of torture, this instrument of torture, and turn it into a sign of life and resurrection, but Christians themselves adopted it eventually as that sign and were willing to face it. Because they had come upon a new understanding in their Savior of what it meant to suffer. They had turned it on its head. And they actually thought, John, that they were participating in the sufferings of Christ, that they were joining him, almost as if they were, taking up their cross and following him, as he said. And I think that's a conception of suffering that it was revolutionary in Tom Holland's thinking to the Western world, and then it survived even to this day. And you see it coming up against Islamic terrorists who want to wield the same kind of power, where 5 million Christians are taking to the streets in Nigeria and saying, they're not saying we're going to come get you, we're not going to exact revenge against you, that we won't be silenced. We will continue to hold to our faith because Jesus transcends suffering. He gives us something more powerful than your fear.
And it's different, but not different today, right? I mean, so suffering was seen in that time period. And by the way, Tom Holland's book, I think you've got an interview with Tom Holland coming up
yes,
on the
Breakpoint
podcast,
shortly.
which is very exciting. I mean, this has been one of those kind of really, really important book, and it's sparked all kinds of really important conversations. It's going to be a great one. But when he talks about it being kind of a thing of fear, suffering is kind of the great enemy today as well. I mean, and it makes sense, right? From a secular worldview, there's nothing beyond this life. So the worst thing you face, the ultimate enemy, is death and pain. And so we do everything in the West to avoid death and pain. It's not seen in the same sense as kind of a means of government control, maybe, but what it is seen is kind of the ultimate enemy, because it means that life is out of our control. And the illusion of modernism, the illusion of a secular viewpoint, is that we can control the world, right? We can make the world one of our own making, and death and pain reminds us that that's not really the case. We can take the world on our shoulders, and it's heavier than we ever thought possible. And so what Christianity does with pain and suffering, and that includes, like right now, how we handle our suffering personally, how we handle the suffering of our relatives in an age where, maybe it's just the cheaper option and the better option to allow them to go ahead and maybe we can encourage and accelerate their death. It's really, there's a parallel here, Shane, that we ought not miss, that the cross transforms suffering. Bonhoeffer said something like that. He said, death is hell and night and cold, if not transformed by our faith. But that's just the thing. Our faith can transform death. And it's a central message. It's for our brothers and sisters in Nigeria and for us today, too.
Well, folks, we're going to take a quick break. You're listening to Breakpoint This Week, and we're talking about the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. Stay with us. We've got more to cover.
We invite you to visit Breakpoint.org, and while you're at our website, be sure to browse our online Colson Center store of books and other resources. And you can find links to our social media sites like Facebook and Twitter.
We're back on Breakpoint This Week. I'm Shane Morris, joined by John Stonestreet. Folks, do remember to visit Breakpoint.org for links to all of the stories and resources we've mentioned here today on the program. John, we closed the last segment talking about the persecution of Christians all throughout the world today, and the way that Christianity in the past has stood up to persecution. And I want to move now to one of our other favorite topics, which is politics. We've got Bernie Sanders here emerging as the unexpected frontrunner in the Democratic presidential race. The Atlantic here reports that Sanders has established himself as the frontrunner by posting significant leads among young people in particular, and the most liberal of voters, and also a more modest advantage among white voters without a college degree. And he's even potentially expanding his lead among Latinos in several polls. In fact, Sanders has also come up neck and neck with Biden with African Americans. So these increases translate to support from, at most, about a third of the Democratic Party, but it's still in a very tight field, this Democratic presidential race. It looks like Bernie Sanders and his uniquely far left ideas could be pulling out ahead here. What do you think that means for the election?
Yeah, I mean, talk about how do Christians deal with pain and suffering. Let's talk about politics, right? So look, we're not political pundits here on this program, although it's tempting because the Las Vegas debates this past week were just so fascinating to watch. It was the first one that Mayor Bloomberg jumped in on. He's been able to buy himself into a kind of the position of being a serious contender, at least at this point. He was pummeled. I mean, he was absolutely pummeled in that. He was the target of most of the back and forth, and you really hit this kind of really interesting place. Whereas on one level, Bloomberg has the money. and he's going to spend the money, he said that he'll stay in the race. There's no reason for him to drop out. He can buy kind of a positioning, which really puts one of the candidates, or one of the, at least the ones that people are talking about, kind of in the same character category that people and the media have placed Donald Trump in. So, and Elizabeth Warren not only admitted it, just said it outright in the opening line. So you've got that. And then it becomes, well, if we've got, two individuals who have the same sort of character, then how do we make kind of this, decision? On the other hand, you've got, somebody who calls himself a socialist. And, I don't agree with Joe Biden very often, but if Bernie Sanders is the nominee, then the Democrats become the party of socialism, not in some sort of, kind of name calling by the right, but by kind of self-acceptance. I mean, this is the name he has chosen kind of for himself. You mentioned a second ago about his polling, particularly among young people, and this is something that you and I have brought up before on this program as well as on Breakpoint, and I think it's worth mentioning. Our short course concludes here this coming week with Jay Richards talking about socialism, and we chose that because it did look like this is becoming kind of a referendum on what kind of economic system, what kind of relationship are we going to have between the government and private property and means of production and all of those sorts of conversations, which for some of us, we kind of grew up looking at those conversations historically. And there was this stark contrast between the West and the communist bloc. And then everybody else was, quote unquote, the third world. And so we had a conversation about this all the way growing up. It was part of our education because it was part of the reality. But we forget that millennials kind of coming into voting and then Gen Zers who are coming into voting age, they did not have that sort of stark kind of real life educational context to have this, even if it wasn't a full education, to at least have the kind of two options there in front of you. And their historical memory. In fact, one of our Colson Fellows in Colorado Springs, who is part of the cohort there and is in the millennial kind of age demographic, brought this up and said, our historical memory doesn't date back to the Cold War. And you remember that and you think, well, who were the bad guys in their history? It was the 2008 financial collapse. Those were the bad guys. And so I think those of kind of older generations who are looking and saying, why this draw to socialism? Well, where have young people been catechized into kind of what these economic systems are, how they affect the political realities, and on a Christian worldview level, what they say about, kind of the nature of the human person, what's wrong with the world and what will fix it. These aren't part of the conversations that these young people have had.
Right. We recently did a Breakpoint, John, about a Time magazine cover story on millennials and how they vote and the long-term trajectory of where their political leanings are. And we argue actually that millennials are looking to politics for something more than, wise policy prescriptions. They're looking to politics for salvation. It's become a kind of religion for many of the younger two generations. Theodore Dalrymple had this great article in First Things, and we quote him in the Breakpoint. He says there's an evangelical tone to the declarations of these younger voters. There's a sorting of the wheat from the chaff, the sheep from the goats, the saved even from the damned. They don't merely want formal changes in politics or legislation. They demand a reform of the human heart and intend to bring it about. And I thought of that this morning when I was reading an article from Rod Dreher where he actually quotes at length a college professor who he talked to in preparation for his new book. And she immigrated from the Soviet Russia to the U.S. as a young woman. And she's looking around her saying, Rod, I don't understand. Why are young people embracing socialism? This is deeply disconcerting to me because the socialism they're embracing isn't even just the Nordic model. I mean, Bernie Sanders has spoken approvingly of the likes of Venezuela and their government. I mean, he's very far in that direction. And she says she thinks the reason we're so complacent about it is American exceptionalism. We think it's sort of a twisted application of it, but she thinks we're suspecting, it can't happen here. The horrors that we saw under socialism, the starvation, the just terrible policies that don't work, that hurt people in the long run. Those sorts of things can't happen here because we're going to get it right. What went wrong in Soviet Russia it was a problem of application or personality. It really didn't have to do with the theory itself. And but I really think Dalrymple hit it on the head with the young people sort of looking to politics as a religious set of solutions, not as a, not a political set.
Yeah, and the worst thing we can think right now, and there was another story this week that illustrates this, is that, well, the way we've always done it is the default position. If we think that just because, well, this is America and this is how we do things, that's enough. I mean, we have to understand, too, that the distrust in kind of traditional institutions among millennials and Gen Zers is at an all-time high. And we had, another example of this. We've been writing for a couple years about the kind of the slow decline of the Boy Scouts. And we had a breakpoint a couple weeks ago, or maybe about a week ago, on kind of the latest story, and got a lot of pushback saying, that's misinformation and that's not it, and so on. And then, this week they filed for bankruptcy. And why are they doing it? They're doing it to shield assets because of, sex abuse claims. And they lost their single largest partner, the LDS Church. And so that is an awful lot of membership. In fact, I was talking this week with a former employee of the Boy Scouts of America, and he was talking about kind of his work and the importance of the LDS Church, even though it was somewhat of a grumpy marriage, that the loss of that is the loss of a lot of members, and members are what they have to take to Congress, and that is what opens up funding. So you can kind of see this kind of downward spiral that's taking place here. And that's what this generation has grown up seeing, right? The collapse, too big to fail. And then, institutions like educational institutions that are basically in so many sort of cases saying, okay, well, whatever you guys want is what we'll actually give you, and we'll let you yell at us and tell us we don't understand. I mean, we've got all these kind of videos of these extreme sorts of situations on college campuses too. So you just look at that, and there's never been a more significant time, at least in my lifetime, in terms of needing to do kind of this base level catechism. We've been talking about this, right, Shane? It's a football analogy. It's Vince Lombardi. Here we go again. Vince Lombardi, after losing in the playoffs one year, starts training camp the next year, holding up, saying, "Gentlemen, this is a football." In other words, we got to go back and remind ourselves what the basics are.
John, there may be something that ties these stories together with young people's idolization of politics and the disintegration of the Boy Scouts before our eyes. I was thinking about this earlier, that the Boy Scouts as an organization is almost one of those institutions that's held America together. It's one of those things that's helped us define ourselves as a people. You might even call it the secular equivalent of a mainline denomination, where these Protestant mainline churches sort of held America together, and our civic life was based around them in so many ways. Well, now they're disintegrating. Their membership is free falling, their churches are closing, and they don't really have a compelling view of life together to offer people. So that's falling apart. And as young people see that, I think perhaps many of them are looking to politics to replace that sort of shared civic life. As the Boy Scouts collapse, the mainline churches collapse, even things like the Salvation Army have come into disrepute. These are things that were universally beloved by Americans for a very long time. Well, we don't have those. And so we're very atomized, as millennials are as a generation. I speak as one. And then the younger generation, Gen Z, they don't have those shared institutions, and they're desperately longing for something to bring us back together as a nation. And their solution, in large part, if Bernie Sanders' poll numbers are to be believed, is the government.
No, you're right. The solution is the government. And again, that underscores something we've already said, which is the opportunity here for the church. And this is really the vision of Chuck Colson when he started the Colson Fellows program. And I bring that up because, I meet people all the time who said, "Oh, yeah, I've been thinking about doing that." What was called the Centurions program when Chuck started it. I've been thinking about, doing that. I'm not sure the time is right. Well, the whole vision of that program is not only to think about worldview and not only be able to kind of articulate it, but to actually become part of the restorative solution, joining God's project to, as he said it, make all things new in Christ. And 2 Corinthians 5, that people who have been reconciled can become ministers of reconciliation. This is kind of what this whole thing has always been about. And what an opportunity, to run into the plague. You and Warren talked last week about Christians running into the coronavirus. And that's just been what Christians have done, since the beginning of time. The church is at its best when it's seeking to actually be restorative and bring good to the world and bring the message of salvation along with making wrong things right again. And this is just kind of what the mission has always been. And I think that's really been why we've seen such incredible growth in the Colson Fellows program over the last couple years, particularly, kind of these regional cohorts, these ways to go through, and now 35, 40 cities in America where you can go through with a group of concerned Christians in your own region, in your own neighborhood. It's a powerful, powerful thing, not to mention the Christian schools that we're able to work with on a daily basis. You can find out more information about all of this at colsonfellows.org. That's colsonfellows.org. But it's exactly the way we hope to see the church kind of meet this crisis/opportunity.
Yeah, John, last week I had the opportunity, actually, I just want to mention this. I had the opportunity to speak to the Florida Colson Fellows cohort here close to my home. And I was amazed by how many folks who came there drove for hours and hours just to meet on a Saturday morning and talk through the curriculum and kick around these ideas and hear from one another. I mean, they really are dedicated to the program there. And I think it's changing. They would tell you that it's changing their lives. And I was amazed by what I saw. Well, folks, we're out of time for today. Do make sure to visit breakpoint.org. We're going to have links to all the stories we've mentioned today on the program, as well as a lot of other resources for you. In particular, I hope you'll subscribe to the Breakpoint podcast if you haven't already. It's where we have some of our best content these days at the Colson Center, some really exciting interviews that we've mentioned today on the program. So come to breakpoint.org for all of that. For John Stonestreet, this is Shane Morris. We'll see you next week.